This will be a short introduction to the student presentation for chapters 3 and 4. This is on filling the void after the Second Vatican Council and the idea of democratization. First, let's talk about musical textures because this is something we will cover throughout the class. These are the various prefixes to understand. Mono being one, poly, many, homo, the same, and a hymn, what a hymn is. These all come from Greek. And the first texture we're going to deal with in our class when it comes to music will be monophony. But in today's class, we're going to be dealing more with homophony. And in this graphic here, you can see the various textures. The monophonic texture is one vocal line that's sung in unison. A polyphonic texture has many different lines which are somewhat independent of one another. And when we get to the idea of polyphony, we'll talk a lot more about that kind of texture. But in this class, I want you to understand also the homophonic texture. This is what we're going to be dealing with when we talk about hymns or a song of praise. So in a homophonic texture in this graphic, you can see that there's a melody line which exists on the top. And then below that, there are various harmonies which are sung by, if you look at a choral piece of music, there are different voice types: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And usually in a hymn, the sopranos, the women or boys, would sing the top line, which is the melody, and then the altos, tenors, and basses below that would sing a supporting harmonic structure. What's important to know about a homophonic texture, different from a polyphonic texture, is that the harmonies below the melody line in homophonic texture are not necessarily independent. So let's talk specifically about hymn. A hymn has these different features, and we're going to use "We Gather Together" as an example of a hymn because it will serve us very well. So a hymn is done strophically, meaning there are different stanzas. And in this example, you can see there are 3 strophes or stanzas. It's also metered. So not only is it metered poetically, but it's also metered musically. So let's take a look at the poetic meter. We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. He chastens and hastens his will to make known. The wicked oppressing now cease from distressing. Sing praises to his name, he forgets not his own. You can see the rhyming structure there. In this particular example, if you look at the very, very bottom of this image, you can see where it says text, and then below that it says tune. And the tune is in all caps. The name of the tune is called Kremser. And then right next to that, I pointed this out before in class, but here you can see 12, 11, 12, 11. That is the poetic meter of the text. So if you count up the syllables in the first line, we gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. It's 12 syllables. He chastens and hastens his will to make known. 11. So there you can see the poetic meter of this particular hymn. It also has a musical meter. This one is in 3/4. Now in this class, we don't necessarily learn how to read music, but in 3/4 or in 4/4, depending, but this one is in 3/4, you can see that at the very top left of the image, 3/4. And 3/4 generally sounds like a waltz, and the emphasis is on beat 1, and beats 2 and 3 are less emphasized. So it sounds like this. We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3. Ba, 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 ba. You can feel that. It almost sounds like a waltz. Uh, like the Blue Danube Waltz by Strauss the Mouse. Okay, those aren't the actual words. So here you see both it's metered poetically and metered musically. And there's that texture, homophonic texture. So if you look at the music here, you see two different staffs. The very top staff is what's called the treble staff, or a G clef, treble clef or G clef. And then below that, you see a bass clef, or what's called also an F clef. And in this particular arrangement, and in most hymns, they're set up exactly the same, going from the bottom to the top staff. You have the basses and then the tenors, and then in the top staff, you have the altos and the sopranos. And if you remember that texture, the bass, tenor, alto support the harmonic structure of the soprano singing the melody. And the soprano melody is what most congregations would sing. Virtually all congregations would only sing the soprano line. There are few where you have congregations of very musical folk who have been ingrained in this for a long time that would sing in parts. But generally speaking, the people would sing the melody, which sounds like this. We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. He chastens and hastens his will to make known. The wicked oppressing now cease from distressing. Sing praises to his name. He forgets not his own. So there we have a homophonic structure. That's the melody, and that is the basics of a hymn. So now let's talk about derivative music. Derivative music is that which we might say is drawn from the popular culture. It derives from the popular culture. And it's only really been the case that popular culture would define music in this way for a couple of hundred years. I mean, we do have derivative music from the Renaissance and the early part of polyphony when we get to that. But it's really taken over in a new way in Catholic liturgical music. So when we have, right after the Second Vatican Council, a lot of Catholic musicians and Catholic liturgists looked to the popular culture to help relate and implement the teachings of the Catholic Church from the Second Vatican Council more fully, to integrate itself with the world around it. So I have put together a playlist for you to hear some of the music that I'm talking about today on YouTube, and I will also have that for you. And one of the examples is from Peter, Paul, and Mary, who were a very popular group in the 1960s. They were singer-songwriters, and they had a very important influence, not only them, but other singer-songwriters at the time who were writing this folk music. They had a very important influence on liturgical music as it followed the Second Vatican Council. And what the people in the Catholic Church wanted more than anything else was for the music to be for the people, by the people, and of the people. And this is what folk music in the popular culture was. And it seemed to make sense for Catholic liturgical music that it should be the same. The Second Vatican Council talked a lot about the people of God being holy and being the focus of the church. And so you can see why this might be the case. So I have an example of Peter, Paul, and Mary in the playlist that you should listen to. And then we have an example of Joe Wise and his song, Gonna Sing My Lord. And you'll be able to hear the relationship between the two. However, Joe Wise's song is very, very simplistic and does not seem to reflect any kind of theological um, or liturgical purpose. It's very general. Gonna sing my Lord for all that I'm worth. Gonna sing my Lord for all that I'm worth, Lord, Lord. And it would repeat that. So it's very simplistic, which is good because the people would be able to sing that. It's for the people, by the people, and of the people. So now we're going to talk about that's basically the mid 1960s to early 1970s. The liturgical music of the 70s and 80s, however, reflects the styles of popular music that it is trying to emulate. And so the styles change quite frequently. And we get in the 70s and 80s the folk revival sound in the Catholic Church maturing. So it's not as simplistic, maybe, three chords and the truth that people might have talked about country music or folk music that Catholic music seemed to be like. But now it matures with different harmonies, and it also matures textually as well. So we get more complicated and biblical texts. And one of the main groups that does this, I have no idea who those people are there in that image anyway. Sorry about that. I think it's a placeholder. But in the 1970s, we get a group who helps move Catholic music forward after the Second Vatican Council, and they're called the St. Louis Jesuits. And they are still very popular to today. And here is an image of the St. Louis Jesuits. These from, you can tell, this kind of the 1970s. But they're using more scriptural texts. Their music, I have also on the playlist some of the songs I've already played in class, like Be Not Afraid, but also some music still popular today, like City of God, for example. Now I'd like to talk to you about an issue that's from the text, and that is relevance and how music in the Catholic Church, liturgical music, should or should not be relevant to the culture. But in the 60s and 70s and 80s, up until today, people in the church tried to be relevant to people. People started noticing priests and nuns and teachers and liturgists and musicians all noticed that less and less people were coming to church, and they wanted to be more relevant. And the church called for itself to be a sign to the modern world. Lumen Gentium, the light to the people, the light to the world. And so priests and liturgists and musicians tried in earnest to be relevant. However, this isn't necessarily the best idea. I mean, yes, of course, we want to be relevant, but it comes out in really odd ways. And I want to show you a couple of images that I took myself from the Manhattan College Chapel when I first started working at Manhattan College in the early 2000s. First image here, you can see that the chaplain at the time, this is early 2000s, he decided that on the Feast of Christ the King, we should have yellow helium balloons. I'm not sure what that meant for the Feast of Christ the King, but I was really surprised to have seen this when I walked into the church. And I think it was his attempt to be relevant. I'm not sure how that worked out, but at least there was an attempt made. But I thought, it's not necessarily a good attempt. Here's another image, and this is taken from right around Valentine's Day when our Sunday Lenten liturgy fell on Valentine's Day. And so the chaplain decided to decorate the sanctuary with heart shaped boxes of chocolates and stuffed teddy bears. And I thought to myself, what have we become trying to be relevant to people? And it was pretty frightening to experience that on that day. I could not believe that the chaplain had done this. It just made no sense whatsoever. And even worse than that was that after communion, when people came in, they were given a raffle ticket. They didn't have to buy it, but they were just given it when they came in. And then after communion, the chaplain decided to stand at the altar and call out numbers from the tickets to give out these heart-shaped boxes of chocolates and stuffed teddy bears. It was an awkward moment, to say the least. This final image comes from the Mass around Halloween, when I walked into the chapel and saw that the chaplain had pulled out large plastic lawn decorations. You can see there's a ghost. There's a jack-o'-lantern that's lighted. A couple of jack-o'-lanterns. A couple of actual jack-o'-lanterns. But it seemed like the chaplain at the time had a desire to be relevant. And I use that as an example of what the church was going through at the time. It struggles with how to be relevant. And oftentimes it does this through music. And we struggled with really, really bad music that people felt, oh, this is relevant. This is what we should be doing. Now, I have a little exercise for you, and I want you to relax. Get comfortable. As this video ends, I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to think of one transcendent musical experience that you might have had. And I want you to write that down. One transcendent musical experience. I want you to write that down, and I want you to bring that to class with you. Thanks. Now, after you've thought about that one beautiful transcendent moment in music, I want to move on, and I'm going to now introduce the second student presentation that we're going to have today. And that is on the diversity of liturgical art and the state of the art. This corresponds to Swain's chapters 5 and 6, but also the supplemental readings from Edward Schaeffer's book and from Anthony Ruff's text as well. It's a very short introduction to this student presentation. So I have a couple questions for you that you can ponder as we consider the readings for this class. Practice or belief, which comes first? The way you practice your faith or your beliefs, or the belief itself? At this point, it might seem pretty obvious. The next question: did you choose your faith, or was it chosen for you? The essence of tradition, from the Latin traditio, is to hand down, to pass on. And if you think about the way that our faith has been passed on to us, if you have a faith, is through tradition, through the passing on. Some of you may have seen the musical Fiddler on the Roof. It begins with a song called Tradition, And they go through the town and what each group of people do, the mamas, the papas, the sons, the daughters. And even Tevye says, I don't know exactly why we do some of the things that we do, but we do them because that's where it came from. So there might be beliefs or practices that you do that were chosen for you. And you might not even realize the reason for them. You can also think of it in a different way, and not just the way it in regards to faith, but think about your own political views. They say two things not to discuss: faith and politics. Let's go. We're talking about both of them. But think about politics. And I'll just tell you a little story. So when I was growing up and was getting ready to register to vote back in the mid 1980s, Ronald Reagan was incredibly popular at the time. And, I didn't know a whole lot about politics. I mean, I did read the paper. I did understand some things, but I also understood that he was incredibly popular at the time. And I remember telling my mom that I was thinking about registering as a Republican, and she stopped in her tracks. And she was like, there's no way that you can be a Republican because your parents are both school teachers. And I was like, that didn't make any sense to me at the time. But her vehement attitude let me know that registering as a Republican was just not possible for me at the time. Of course, later I understood that. But if you think about that, think about the way your parents believe politically. It may be the same way that you believe. Or it also could be the case that maybe your parents are Roman Catholics, but you yourself have decided maybe at this point in your life when you're, in your early 20s, late teens, and you've just decided, I don't know if I believe in any of that stuff. That is a good thing. That is a really good thing. Questioning one's beliefs, very, very important. I'll never forget when I was talking to a priest one time and I said, Father, I have a lot of doubts. And he said, well, thanks be to God for that. Because if you don't have doubts, that means your faith is actually kind of weak. And I thought, well, that, at the time I was like, this is ridiculous. I have no idea why you just said that. Now I'm even more confused. But as I've grown older, I understand the wisdom in that. Final question. Why does liturgical music matter? It's a good question, right? Why does liturgical music matter? Why are we studying this? In the last class, I talked about the Pope, and I talked about the billions of people that he leads in the Catholic faith. Well, there's many, many different ways to believe, even within the Catholic Church. Some people might call themselves cafeteria Catholics. Well, I believe this, but I don't believe that. Well, or I practice this, but I don't necessarily practice that. Think about liturgical music, why it matters. Is it a unifier? Does it divide us? Someone's music is better than others? It's an interesting question. And now I know that our student presenters will talk about this a little bit more, but let's talk about this concept, lex orandi, which means the law of prayer or the way we pray. Lex orandi gets at the heart of the prayer or the practice of one's beliefs coming first. Are you somebody that believes that the way you pray, what you do, the practice informs the way you believe? Or are you somebody that believes lex credendi, that No, clearly you have to believe first before you can practice your faith. There are many different theologians throughout the history of the church who have advocated one as more important than the other, but they have a sort of symbiotic relationship. Finally, I'd like to end this intro to this presentation with this incredible quote by Martha Graham. Martha Graham was a dancer, a preeminent ballerina, but also a great artist. And I want you to think about this. And think about how that might affect you in your own studies, in your own life. I know when I read this, it was like a dagger in my heart. I'll tell you a little story before we end, and that is when I was working at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania. I was doing a job at the university, which was enjoyable. And I said to my student worker at the time, I said, "Yeah, I really like this job." And she said, "Yeah, but it's too easy for you." And I was like, "Oh, wow." Another dagger to my heart. She goes, "Yeah, this doesn't challenge you." And in the moments of thought that followed what she said to me, changed the course of my life, because I realized that I had been settling for mediocre. And as a human being, I didn't want to just be mediocre. Why should that be okay when it comes to art of any kind, including liturgical music? Oh, that'll be fine. That'll do what it needs to do. I think we need to keep that in mind when it comes to liturgical music or any art that we have in the Catholic liturgy. Imagine if people had said that about the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. They said, "Oh, well, we could just put up a meeting room. It doesn't have to be that beautiful. We just need to have a place to meet and have Mass." It seems ridiculous. We shouldn't be able to talk about liturgical music in the same fashion either.